I want to tell you a story about something called Agile. It started out as something related to software development. That's how I'm going to talk about it. It actually has permeated lots of different areas of business now. You may have gone through an Agile transformation in your organization yourself, or you may hear of one. So everything I'm going to tell you actually applies in a larger scope beyond software, but I'm going to focus on it from software. It all began in 2001 in February. 17 of the leading industry people in software development got together to try to figure out what was wrong with software development. So in the 80s and 90s, software projects were failing on a spectacular scale. They failed more often than they succeeded. They were costing lots of money, not delivering, taking forever. And so these folks got together and said, what can we do to fix it? Now this is extraordinary to me for the simple fact that, can you imagine any other industry, banking or medicine or anything else, where the leaders get together and say, we've been doing this completely wrong. How are we going to fix this? I think that took a lot of courage, and then also they actually came away with a beautiful, elegant solution, I feel like. So that was the birth of what they call the Agile Manifesto. What they came away with were 4 value statements. It's really just 4 simple statements. I blurred 2 of them out because we don't really have time to talk about them, but they're important as well. This is the entirety of the birth of Agile, these 4 simple value statements. 2 we're going to talk about. The first one says individuals and interactions are valued over processes and tools, and the other one is working software is valued over comprehensive documentation. One of the things that's brilliant about these value statements is they're saying we value both things in this equation. So we value people and we also value processes. It's not one or the other. And we value working software and we also value documentation of the software. They're just saying that they discovered that people should be valued a little more than the processes, and delivering working software should be valued a little more than the documentation. Now, that may sound innocent and not very powerful. It's actually incredibly powerful and profound. It is the birth of all of this. What they found is that what was wrong with software development in the 80s and 90s is that they valued processes more than people. That's what led to the failure. What you need to do to be successful is value people more than processes. But it's a balance, right? And so what the founders of Agile were saying is you have to identify who your core people are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you have to build a process around them. All right, so remember this. I know this sounds real esoteric, but we're going to come back to this. Process over people is failure. People over process is success. They're both still important, but that's what we want to remember. So the bottom line is you cannot build an organization the way you would build a building. This is just so incredibly important. We cannot build systems for organizations and do anything for organizations the same way that you would do it for a building. And what was happening in the 80s and 90s is that people were trying to build software the way you would build a building, which makes perfect sense from a certain standpoint. So in other words, they would spend a lot of time architecting the system, documenting it, then they would go away for a long time and build it, and then they would come and deliver it to the organization, a year and a half later, and it was failing miserably. And the reason is because organizations are living things. They're not inanimate objects. Inanimate objects, like a building, respond to completely different laws of nature than organizations do. So individuals within organizations, the organizations themselves, are what complexity theorists call complex adaptive systems. And there's a whole set of laws and rules that govern them. In a building, the building will respond to Newtonian physics, the laws of gravity and force and tension and all of that sort of thing. The laws of complexity theory that govern organizations is completely different. One of the laws that governs organizations is that they're unpredictable. The behavior of complex adaptive systems, living organisms, is fundamentally unpredictable. So if you have birds on an electrical wire, there's no way for you to know when they're going to leave and in what direction they're going to fly. Whereas inanimate objects, like a building, are very predictable. So my wife and I like to go camping at Wind Creek State Park in Lake Martin in Alexander City. And we were there a few weeks ago, and I was going for a walk early in the morning, and there's a tower out there called Smith Tower. It's got a spiral staircase. You can go to the top, 30, 40 feet high, so it overlooks the lake. So I climbed this tower, and I was looking out over the lake. Now this tower, it's called Smith Tower, it was built in 1913, 10 years before the lake was even dammed. When it was built, a farmer built it, and it was just on a mountain overlooking a valley, which became the lake. And so it's been standing there through World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, dozens of presidential terms, the birth of rock and roll. That tower has been standing there like that way for over 100 years. Very little change. But as I'm standing there, overlooking the lake, overlooking many, many square miles of the lake, it's at sunrise, it's glass surface. All of a sudden there's an explosion below me in the lake, and it's schools of bass feeding on schools of minnows. And as a fisherman, I was like, wow, I'd love to be down there in a boat to catch those fish. But it only lasted for a few seconds, and then it was glass again. Then, a quarter of a mile away, it happens again. That settles down. 400 yards over here, it happens again. And I realized, even if I was out there in a boat, the chances of me finding those fish at the next time they're going to surface were very, very small. That's the difference between a living organism and an inanimate object. That tower stands there obeying the laws of physics for over 100 years. Those fish are unpredictable, and there's a lot of other things about them too. So if you're involved in managing an organization, building systems for an organization, working with people, you're working with the fish. You're not working with the tower. And that's why you can't build systems the way you would build a building. All of that comes from complexity theory. A lot of people don't realize, but the founders of Agile were actually really well versed in complexity theory. They understood these things that I'm talking about at a very low level. It's a super fascinating, profound topic, and ironically, it's not that complicated. There's a lot of simple things about it. So we don't have time to go into it anymore, but let's get lunch one day and talk about it. It's really interesting. So they get together in 2001, they say, what's wrong with our industry? Here's what's wrong. We're valuing processes over people. We're valuing documentation over delivering software. And so almost immediately, everybody starts saying, okay, well, how do we implement this Agile manifesto in the real world? What can we do to actually make this happen? So they start coming up with what's called Agile methodologies. So Agile methodology is not the Agile manifesto. Agile methodologies are ways to implement this. And the one that won the battle was a methodology called Scrum. So it comes from the notion of a rugby scrum. And I'm convinced the reason this methodology won the battle is because the metaphor is really easy to wrap your head around. You know, the idea is we're all going to get together, collaborate, meet, then we're going to go deliver some software to the users, get their feedback, come back, make changes, and repeat and go through that. But what is another word for a methodology? It's process. They actually were sowing the seeds of their own destruction right from the very beginning. Because what happens when people start putting together processes? They just grow and grow and grow, and it becomes more elaborate and more complex. And before you know it, 20 years later, 25 years later, we live in a world where Scrum and Agile in general has become the very thing it was intended to combat. The thing about this is, great systems are not built by great processes. Great systems are built by great people. And you can't just create a process like this, like you would build a building. You know, when you build a building, there's a construction plan, and then you can bring whatever subs you want to do the electrical and the plumbing or whatever. For the most part, they'll do their part and leave. They're kind of replaceable. Software development's not like that. It's a creative process. Those people are not interchangeable in that way. Great systems are built by great people, not by great processes. So Scrum has almost become a parody of itself. Here's what I mean by that. I think this is so funny. These people are not collaborating. These people are fighting. They're fighting over the ball. And I imagine the person in the green shirt back there as the business owner who's writing all these millions of dollars of checks for software going, guys, where's my software? What are you doing? And then the other thing I'd like to say is, does this look like forward progress to you? Is that a metaphor of forward progress? No, it's a metaphor of stalemate, which is what this process looks like a lot in the world today. You might look at that and go, well, how can that be? They figured out how to fix this 20 years ago with Agile. How are we failing like we were in the old days with what they call the waterfall process? But it's simple. It's because we started worshiping at the feet of process again. And that's actually a term that the Agile folks used. You know, in the 80s and 90s, we were worshiping at the feet of process. And we've come right back to the same spot. It's amazing if you think about it at a high level. There's a lot of backlash against this now. And the reason, of course, is that Scrum is no longer Agile. In fact, Agile, capital A Agile, is no longer Agile at all, the lowercase a of what Agile really is supposed to mean. It has become bureaucratic, full of red tape, endless meetings, endless documentation, overbearing, it wastes time, it wastes money, kills creativity, and it's slow. It is so slow. If you really follow the religion of Agile today, it takes forever to get software out the door. Getting back to the analogy of the tower and the fish, let's say you were writing a system to help those bass catch those schools of minnow. If you go away for 6 months and write that system and come back and deliver it to those bass, they're going to say, well, we don't do that anymore. That's not how we do it. They're only doing that in the fall. You come back and deliver that to them in the spring or the winter, they're off doing something else. It's useless to them. That's why the word Agile is Agile from the original founders, is because they said organizations are fundamentally unpredictable, and when we're building systems for them, we've got to deliver working software into the organization very, very quickly and rapidly and often, because the organization is going to change right out from underneath us. And so what Scrum is today is you can spend months working on a release of software. Well, by the time you do that, the organization, their needs have changed a lot of times. The other thing that is incredibly ironic about this to me is that the whole point of all this process, that New York subway map and all of this process, the whole point of it supposedly is to manage the technical people. There's almost no accountability for the technical people anymore in this process because they can hide in it. They can come to meetings and go to stand-ups and, give you user point stories and whatever, and then, you give them something to work on, and they've got 2 weeks or 6 week sprint to work on it. They may not work on it at all for the first week and a half or 2 weeks, and then the last 2 or 3 days they're working on it a little bit, show up at their meeting and go, yeah, I've got these roadblocks. It's just ironic. The whole thing has become a parody of itself. So it's a classic situation of the emperor has no clothes. Who is going to stand up and say this is madness? No one wants to stand up and say it anymore. And it makes sense from a certain standpoint, because what was the alternative? I mean, the answer to Agile was Agile 20 years ago. It's just we're not doing it anymore. But that really is the answer. And then if you're in an organization going through this, you're going to say, well, what choice do we have? We have to be Agile, right? Our competitors are Agile. We have to go through an Agile transformation. We have to follow Scrum. How are we going to compete if we don't? But there's a whole world of practitioners who understand the madness of this and who do it in a practical, common sense sort of way, but they don't know what to call themselves. They don't know how to say it. So we've started this company called Agile Microdosing. The point of it is to give a home, first of all, to people who are out there trying to do this the right way, and to give people a community and a way to say, let's stop the madness, let's do it more in a microdosing kind of way. Now, we're not advocating mind-altering drugs here, but we are co-opting this term, because this term, microdosing, perfectly describes the approach that we want to take. We want to peel back all this nonsense and just apply the tools in a very limited, small way, the way it was intended by the original founders of Agile. And then we want to be kind of subversive and counterculture, and we want to go against the grain a little bit. And so that's part of the brand of this also, because it has become a religion. Scrum and Agile has become a religion with its own priesthood and everything else. People are terrified to push back on this stuff. All right, so how do we do it? First of all, we have 3 simple roles that we identify in projects: the merchant, the mage, and the magistrate. The merchant is the business owner, the person writing the checks for the software, or the person who understands the business enough to know what the software is supposed to do. That's the merchant. The mage is the technical magician, the person who knows how to make the magic happen technically. And the magistrate is what you would think of as the project manager, the person who's keeping the trains running on time. So again, in any given project, there's really only a handful of people who are the most experienced, the most knowledgeable, the most qualified to play these roles. And now, one person can play more than one of these roles, and you may have more than one person playing these roles. But the point is, what we want to do is we want to go in and say, who are the key players here? Let's support and empower those people to make the decisions, to get things done, to decide what the architecture is going to be, to manage the process. And then let's apply process to them only as much as they need to get the job done. From there, what we do is we try to strip away all the nonsense and just put the processes in place that need to be there to make things happen. So there's this great scene in Saving Private Ryan where a new soldier comes in and he's going to be under the command of Tom Hanks. And the guy, he's coming straight out of training. He's got all this gear on him. I mean, he's just got everything you could imagine that they tell him you're supposed to have to go into battle, I guess. He's even got a typewriter. And he walks up to Tom Hanks, and Tom Hanks just looks at him and throws a typewriter away, and then he starts immediately just taking stuff off of it, saying, you don't need that, you don't need that, you don't need that. Taking things off and throwing them on the ground. And then the guy's kind of rattled, and so the guy turns around, starts to walk away, and he leaves his rifle behind. And Tom Hanks picks the rifle up and goes, no, you're going to need this. So that's what we can do. We can come into a software development organization or an agile transformation that's gone sideways or whatever, and we can strip away all the nonsense, find out who the real players are, and then rebuild a process around those people the way it's supposed to be done. So George Patton, his motto was attack, attack, attack. He hated defensive positions. He said trenches are pre-dug graves. And in software development, you got to deliver, deliver, deliver. You've got to be putting software out in front of the users as often as you can. And when we get wrapped around the axles with process and documentation, all this other stuff, we're digging our own pre-dug graves when we do that. So software development and other projects like this, they're as much art as they are science. Creative, artistic people have to have room and headspace to be creative and artistic. The mages in our role playing, they have to have time to contemplate and be creative and come up with solutions. And so there are software development shops that have their programmers in meetings 3, 4, 5 hours a day. No one's going to get anything done. No wonder it's so slow. No wonder software doesn't come out the other side. You know, I personally think if your developers on your team are having more than 1 or 2 hours of meetings a week, you're probably doing it wrong. They've got to be allowed to do their thing. But there's got to be accountability. And so that's one of the things that we really struggle to do is to give the technical people, the mages, the freedom, the creativity that they need, but also hold them accountable. Also have it crystal clear what it is they're supposed to be delivering. And I can tell you, because I am one, the technical people are some of the hardest people to manage on earth. I mean, maybe NFL wide receivers are maybe harder, but not very many. So it's a real balance, but you got to be able to do those two things. What we can do is we can do training, we're going to provide certifications, we can do project management, we can unwind an agile transformation that's gone sideways. We can do software development. If you have a software development project, you want to do that. We can help with recruiting. I mean, if you need staff augmentation or you need people, technical people, project managers to come into your project, your organization, you already understand these concepts, we can do that. And working with Chase and Deploy. So there's a lot of things we can do to move this along. All right, anyway, these are just some books. This is kind of a mini library that has sort of guided our thinking. And I just want to put this up because I referenced some of it. I want to give them a shout out. But Agile Software Development Ecosystems by Jim Highsmith, that's the one that talks about how this was all born. Navigating Complexity, phenomenal book, written in the 90s, but it's just incredible how it simplifies what's really going on in organizations with complexity theory. The Goal Rat, that's kind of the birth of lean constraints theory and all of that. Flow by Chizinta Mahali, I can never know how to pronounce that. And then of course all the books by Marcus Buckingham. So I can refer you to these if you're interested in them.